When Tulsi Gabbard publicly warned that the Democratic Party had become an elitist machine disconnected from ordinary Americans, Nancy Pelosi didn't answer her with facts. She answered her with power. And that contrast alone told voters more than any campaign ad ever could. That sentence, whether people love Tulsi Gabbard or loathe her, whether they admire Nancy Pelosi or distrust her, captures the emotional fault line that now runs straight through American politics. Because this was never just about ideology, it was about who gets to speak, who gets protected, and who gets quietly pushed out of the room when the conversation becomes uncomfortable. My own view, and I won't hide it because transparency matters when credibility is on the line, is that this clash is not about heroes and villains in the cartoon sense, but about two radically different interpretations of power, responsibility, and loyalty to institutions that are rapidly losing public trust. Tulsi Gabbard represents the uncomfortable question many voters feel but rarely hear articulated clearly, while Nancy Pelosi represents institutional continuity so entrenched that it sometimes confuses criticism with betrayal. And that tension is not accidental, it is structural. And if you're wondering whether this confrontation was inevitable, the honest answer is yes. Because when political systems calcify, dissent does not knock politely. It crashes through the door. Tulsi Gabbard did not rise as a typical Washington figure, and that matters more than her critics like to admit. Because political culture is not just shaped by policy positions, but by the environments that train a person to respond under pressure. A combat veteran, a former Democrat, and someone who openly broke with party leadership on foreign policy, Gabbard learned early that dissent inside a dominant political tribe comes with consequences that are rarely proportional to the offense. Nancy Pelosi, by contrast, is the ultimate product of congressional seniority, a figure whose authority was built layer by layer over nearly 4 decades, reinforced by donor networks, committee leverage, and a party structure that rewards loyalty far more than curiosity. When Pelosi speaks, she does so with the weight of the institution behind her. And when Gabbard speaks, she does so with the weight of alienation. And those two forces collide in ways that are both politically revealing and personally brutal. This is why every exchange between them, even indirect ones, feels heavier than a normal political disagreement. Because it is not just a clash of opinions, it is a clash of ecosystems. Nancy Pelosi has long framed herself as a defender of democracy, and in many respects, that framing is supported by her legislative history, particularly during moments when institutional norms were under genuine strain. However, power exercised for decades develops blind spots, and one of those blind spots is the assumption that moral authority naturally follows positional authority, even when public trust begins to erode. Tulsi Gabbard's critiques often land not because they are radical, but because they echo sentiments that voters already feel yet struggle to articulate without being dismissed as unserious or disloyal. When Gabbard questioned the Democratic Party's handling of foreign interventions, or its intolerance for internal dissent, she wasn't just making policy arguments, she was challenging the party's self-image as inherently virtuous. That is the kind of challenge institutions fear most, because it cannot be easily neutralized by fact checks or procedural maneuvers. It requires introspection, and introspection is politically expensive. One of the most controversial elements of this rivalry centers on accusations of selective accountability, particularly around issues like congressional stock trading, political privilege, and the perception of a protected ruling class. Nancy Pelosi has repeatedly stated that she supports transparency and ethics reforms, yet critics, including Tulsi Gabbard, have pointed out the dissonance between those statements and the broader congressional resistance to banning individual stock trading. This is where public frustration intensifies because Americans do not need to believe in secret conspiracies to recognize that access to information and influence creates advantages that ordinary citizens simply do not possess. Tulsi Gabbard did not invent this frustration, she tapped into it. And by doing so, she made herself radioactive to a party leadership that depends on controlling the narrative of moral legitimacy. Is it really unreasonable, many voters quietly ask, to expect lawmakers to avoid financial activities that even appear to benefit from insider knowledge? Or is the outrage itself now considered a political crime? Nancy Pelosi's defenders often respond by emphasizing legality, and legality matters. But politics has never been governed by legality alone. It is governed by perception, trust, and the belief that leaders operate under the same rules as the public. When that belief erodes, no amount of procedural correctness can fully restore confidence. And this is where Pelosi's experience becomes both her strength and her vulnerability. Decades in power create institutional memory, but they also create distance, a gap between leadership and lived reality that no press release can bridge. Tulsi Gabbard, intentionally or not, positions herself as a translator of that gap, someone willing to say aloud what others only whisper for fear of professional exile. That does not make her infallible, but it makes her dangerous to systems that survive on silence. The media's role in this dynamic cannot be ignored, because coverage patterns often reveal more about power than about truth. Nancy Pelosi is frequently treated as a stabilizing force, a symbol of continuity, while Tulsi Gabbard is framed as disruptive, controversial, or ideologically inconsistent, labels that subtly delegitimize dissent without directly refuting it. Yet, disruption is not inherently destructive, and stability is not inherently virtuous, especially when stability preserves systems that no longer serve the public equitably. This is where humor and irony creep into the conversation, because watching establishment figures accuse dissenters of endangering democracy while refusing to reform visibly broken incentives borders on political theater. At times, the performance feels less like governance and more like an exclusive dinner party where criticism is tolerated only if it flatters the host. There is also a generational undercurrent here that deserves attention, because Pelosi's rise occurred in a political era where loyalty to party infrastructure was often rewarded with influence and protection. Gabbard's political coming-of-age happened in a fragmented media environment where independent voices could reach millions without institutional blessing, and that shift terrifies traditional power centers. When Pelosi dismisses critics as irresponsible or misguided, she may believe she is defending order, but to many voters, it sounds like a refusal to engage with uncomfortable realities. When Tulsi Gabbard challenges party leadership, she risks oversimplification, but she also forces conversations that would otherwise be indefinitely postponed. The real question is not who is right in every instance, but why the system reacts so aggressively to internal criticism while appearing oddly tolerant of structural failure. This confrontation also exposes a deeper philosophical divide about what loyalty means in a democracy. Nancy Pelosi's version of loyalty prioritizes unity, message discipline, and institutional preservation, especially during moments of external threat. Tulsi Gabbard's version of loyalty prioritizes accountability, even when that accountability destabilizes existing hierarchies. Neither definition is inherently evil, but they cannot coexist comfortably, and pretending otherwise only delays the inevitable reckoning. At what point does unity become complicity? And at what point does dissent become self-indulgence disguised as courage? As this story continues, the focus will move deeper into the ethics of power, congressional privilege, and the growing belief among voters that political accountability in Washington has become optional rather than expected. The clash between Tulsi Gabbard and Nancy Pelosi is not an anomaly. It is a preview of what happens when institutional power meets public skepticism head-on. Whether that collision produces reform or further fracture remains an open question, but one thing is already clear. Pretending everything is fine is no longer an option. The conversation inevitably turns to money, not because money is the only measure of power in Washington, but because it is the one language that never lies about who benefits from the system and who merely survives under it. Tulsi Gabbard understood this long before she ever became a recurring target of Democratic leadership criticism, because nothing exposes political hypocrisy faster than watching lawmakers passionately defend ethics in theory while quietly resisting them in practice. Nancy Pelosi has consistently argued that members of Congress should be allowed to participate in the stock market because America is a free market economy, a phrase that sounds principled until voters begin to notice how asymmetrically that freedom appears to operate. This is where Gabbard's critique becomes especially uncomfortable, because she does not accuse Pelosi of illegality. She accuses the system Pelosi defends of moral incoherence, and that distinction matters far more than pundits are willing to admit. When legality becomes the ceiling of ethical expectation rather than the floor, trust begins to decay in ways no election cycle can easily repair. It is a documented fact that congressional leaders receive classified briefings, early policy signals, and strategic insights unavailable to the public. And it is equally documented that many Americans find it hard to believe those insights never influence personal financial decisions. Tulsi Gabbard has repeatedly questioned why a body tasked with regulating entire industries should be financially entangled with those same industries, framing the issue not as a scandal, but as a credibility crisis. Nancy Pelosi, in response, has often emphasized disclosure requirements and existing safeguards, presenting them as sufficient proof that the system polices itself effectively. But here is the problem critics keep circling back to, and it refuses to go away no matter how many times it is dismissed as populist noise. A system that investigates itself rarely inspires confidence among people who have no seat at the table. Is it really radical or merely inconvenient to suggest that lawmakers should voluntarily avoid even the appearance of conflicts of interest? What makes this debate sharper is the contrast between personal experience and institutional insulation, because Tulsi Gabbard speaks from a background where accountability is immediate and unforgiving. In the military, mistakes are not smoothed over by press secretaries or delayed by committee reviews. They have consequences that arrive quickly and without negotiation. Nancy Pelosi's world operates differently, shaped by layers of advisors, procedural buffers, and the quiet understanding that seniority itself is a form of protection. Neither system is inherently wrong, but when they intersect in a democracy, friction is inevitable, especially when one side insists the other simply doesn't understand how Washington works. That phrase, often used dismissively, has become a punchline among voters who increasingly believe that understanding how Washington works is precisely the problem. Media coverage plays a crucial role in reinforcing this divide, because framing determines whether criticism is treated as legitimate inquiry or as personal attack. When Tulsi Gabbard raises questions about congressional privilege, headlines frequently describe her as combative or opportunistic, subtly shifting focus away from the substance of her argument. When Nancy Pelosi deflects those same questions, the coverage often emphasizes her experience and leadership, as if longevity alone answers ethical concerns. This imbalance is not necessarily the result of coordinated bias, but it is the product of a media ecosystem that has grown comfortable orbiting power rather than interrogating it. The result is a feedback loop where establishment figures are insulated from sustained scrutiny while dissenters are pressured to justify their tone instead of their claims. There is an almost darkly humorous element to this dynamic because politicians who warn endlessly about threats to democracy often react most aggressively when democratic accountability is applied to them personally. Watching seasoned lawmakers bristle at basic questions about transparency can feel less like a serious debate and more like a board meeting interrupted by an intern who accidentally asked something honest. Tulsi Gabbard's refusal to soften her language for institutional comfort is precisely what makes her both compelling to certain audiences and intolerable to party leadership. Nancy Pelosi's insistence on discipline and unity reflects a belief that public disagreement weakens the party, even when that disagreement addresses issues voters clearly care about. At what point does protecting the brand become more important than confronting the flaws within it? Another layer of this confrontation lies in how each woman understands political risk because their calculations are shaped by entirely different incentives. Pelosi has spent decades minimizing volatility, mastering the art of incremental control, and avoiding unpredictable outcomes that could fracture coalitions. Gabbard, on the other hand, appears willing to absorb personal political damage if it allows her to force conversations that would otherwise remain buried. That willingness is often framed as recklessness, but it can also be read as a refusal to treat political survival as the highest moral good. The irony is that both approaches claim to serve democracy, yet they arrive at radically different conclusions about how much discomfort democracy should be allowed to endure. This divide became especially visible when Gabbard openly criticized the Democratic Party's approach to foreign policy, a domain Pelosi has long treated as a delicate balance between principle and pragmatism. Gabbard's skepticism toward interventionism challenged assumptions that had gone largely unchallenged within party leadership circles for years. Pelosi's response was not to engage deeply with the critique, but to question Gabbard's judgment and reliability, effectively shifting the debate from policy substance to personal credibility. That move was politically effective, but it also reinforced the perception that dissent is tolerated only until it threatens consensus at the top. Is a party truly confident in its ideas if it must constantly police the boundaries of acceptable disagreement? The clash between Tulsi Gabbard and Nancy Pelosi also reflects a broader anxiety about control in an era where political narratives can no longer be fully managed. Social media, alternative platforms, and fragmented audiences mean that voices outside institutional approval can still reach millions, sometimes with devastating effectiveness. Pelosi's generation built power through centralized messaging and hierarchical control, while Gabbard's rise coincided with a decentralization that undermines those tools. This is why attempts to marginalize dissent often backfire, transforming critics into symbols of resistance rather than silencing them. The more aggressively institutions push back, the more they validate the suspicion that something is being protected from scrutiny. What ultimately unsettles observers is not that Tulsi Gabbard challenges Nancy Pelosi, but that so many voters recognize elements of truth in that challenge, regardless of whether they agree with Gabbard on every issue. Trust, once fractured, does not respond well to lectures about complexity or experience. It responds to humility, transparency, and restraint. Nancy Pelosi's career is filled with legislative achievements, but achievements alone do not inoculate leaders against accountability fatigue. Tulsi Gabbard's criticisms may be imperfect, but they tap into a hunger for a political class that appears willing to live under the same constraints it imposes on others. And that hunger is not going away simply because it makes powerful people uncomfortable. As this analysis continues, the focus will shift toward how dissent is punished inside political parties, how loyalty tests replace open debate, and why figures like Tulsi Gabbard are often treated as existential threats rather than internal critics. The deeper question remains unresolved and increasingly unavoidable. Can American political institutions reform themselves from within, or will they continue mistaking control for stability until the public stops believing either one exists? That question hangs over every exchange between Tulsi Gabbard and Nancy Pelosi, shaping not only their rivalry, but the future credibility of the system they both claim to serve. At some point, every political party must decide whether it values obedience more than adaptability, because the two rarely coexist for long without one suffocating the other. The conflict between Tulsi Gabbard and Nancy Pelosi exposes this dilemma with uncomfortable clarity, not through a single explosive moment, but through a pattern of quiet punishments, strategic sidelining, and reputational framing that is almost invisible unless you know how to look for it. This is not the crude kind of discipline people imagine when they hear the phrase party retaliation. There are no shouted threats or public ultimatums, only doors that stop opening, calls that stop being returned, and opportunities that mysteriously evaporate. Tulsi Gabbard experienced this process gradually, then all at once, as her policy disagreements began to translate into doubts about her character rather than her ideas. Nancy Pelosi, as a leader whose authority depended on cohesion, viewed this mechanism not as cruelty, but as maintenance, the political equivalent of pruning branches to protect the tree. Inside modern American parties, dissent is rarely punished for being wrong. It is punished for being contagious. When a figure like Gabbard voices skepticism about foreign policy consensus or questions the moral clarity of interventionist rhetoric, leadership does not only hear disagreement, it hears the possibility that others might follow. Pelosi's approach to leadership has always emphasized message discipline, because fractured narratives weaken negotiating power and embolden opponents. From her perspective, allowing high-profile dissent risks turning internal debate into public spectacle, something she has spent decades trying to prevent. From Gabbard's perspective, suppressing that debate transforms a political party into an echo chamber that confuses unity with health. This is where the clash becomes almost philosophical, because both women claim to be protecting democracy, yet they disagree fundamentally on what democracy requires to survive. Pelosi's model prioritizes stability, continuity, and the careful management of public perception, especially during moments of national tension. Gabbard's model prioritizes honesty, even when that honesty disrupts alliances or undermines carefully constructed narratives. Neither approach is free from risk, but the refusal to acknowledge those risks openly is what fuels public cynicism. How strong can a democratic institution really be if it treats internal criticism as a threat rather than a resource? The role of party leadership in shaping acceptable opinion becomes particularly visible during moments of crisis, when unity is framed as a moral imperative. After major national events, Pelosi consistently emphasized solidarity and discipline, warning against rhetoric that could confuse the public or aid political opponents. Gabbard, however, often argued that clarity matters more than comfort, especially when the costs of policy decisions are measured in human lives rather than polling data. This divergence explains why Gabbard's statements were often labeled irresponsible, even when they echoed concerns expressed quietly by others behind closed doors. The difference was not content, but courage, and courage is far more difficult for institutions to manage than error. There is a subtle irony here that borders on the absurd, because political systems that pride themselves on diversity of thought frequently enforce conformity with remarkable efficiency. Watching party leaders praise inclusion while narrowing the range of acceptable dissent feels, to many voters, like watching a magician insist There is no trick while sawing the box in half. Tulsi Gabbard's presence made that trick harder to ignore because she did not fit neatly into the caricatures usually used to dismiss dissenters. She was not an outsider shouting from the margins. She was a veteran, a former vice chair of the party, someone who had played by the rules long enough to understand how selectively they are applied. That made her criticisms more threatening, because they could not be easily written off as ignorance or bad faith. Nancy Pelosi's defenders often argue that leadership requires difficult decisions, including deciding whose voices amplify the mission and whose complicate it. That argument has merit, especially in a polarized environment where every internal disagreement is weaponized externally. But the cost of that approach is cumulative, and it shows up in declining trust, disengagement, and the growing belief that political parties care more about control than representation. Gabbard's treatment became, for many observers, a case study in how institutions manage inconvenient truths by managing the people who speak them. The question then becomes not whether Pelosi acted strategically, but whether strategy alone can sustain legitimacy. Humor, once again, slips into the picture in uncomfortable ways because the spectacle of seasoned politicians warning about authoritarianism while enforcing ideological compliance is not lost on the public. Online, the contrast became a source of biting satire, with jokes about free speech zones inside political parties and loyalty oaths that exist everywhere except on paper. While such humor may seem trivial, it signals something deeper, a cultural recognition that the gap between rhetoric and reality has grown too wide to ignore. Tulsi Gabbard did not create that gap, but she became one of its most visible markers. Nancy Pelosi did not intend to personify it, but leadership positions often absorb symbolism whether their occupants like it or not. Another dimension of this confrontation involves the concept of political forgiveness, or rather, the lack of it. Once Gabbard was framed as unreliable, every subsequent statement was filtered through that assumption, reinforcing a narrative that became increasingly difficult to escape. Pelosi's leadership style, effective in consolidating power, leaves little room for rehabilitation once trust is deemed broken. This zero-sum approach may protect short-term cohesion, but it discourages long-term adaptability, especially in a rapidly changing political landscape. How many potential reformers never emerge simply because the cost of disagreement is career-ending? The treatment of dissenters sends a message not only to the individual, but to everyone watching. It teaches ambitious politicians what to avoid saying, which questions not to ask, and which principles to soften in order to survive. Tulsi Gabbard's willingness to accept marginalization rather than retreat into silence made her an anomaly in that system. Nancy Pelosi's willingness to enforce boundaries made her an effective leader within it. The tragedy, if there is one, lies in the fact that both roles are products of the same institutional design. As this examination moves forward, attention will turn to how these internal dynamics shape public outcomes, foreign policy decisions, and the growing disconnect between political leadership and lived experience. The rivalry between Tulsi Gabbard and Nancy Pelosi is not simply personal, it is structural, revealing how power responds when challenged from within rather than attacked from without. Whether that response ultimately strengthens or weakens democratic institutions depends on a question that remains unresolved. Can a system that fears its own critics still claim to trust the people it governs? That question lingers, unanswered, shaping every silence, every dismissal, and every carefully chosen word spoken in the halls of power. Power does not exist in a vacuum. And in modern American politics, media functions as both amplifier and shield, deciding not only what the public sees, but how it is allowed to feel about what it sees. The confrontation between Tulsi Gabbard and Nancy Pelosi cannot be understood without examining how narratives are constructed, defended, and repeated until they harden into accepted truth. Pelosi has benefited for decades from a media environment that treats institutional authority as a proxy for credibility, while Gabbard has navigated a landscape where deviation from party consensus often triggers suspicion rather than curiosity. This difference is not accidental. It reflects an unwritten hierarchy in political storytelling, where continuity is framed as responsibility and disruption is framed as danger. Once those roles are assigned, escaping them becomes extraordinarily difficult. Media framing does not require overt hostility to be effective. It operates through emphasis, omission, and tone. When Nancy Pelosi speaks, coverage frequently highlights her experience, her strategic mind, and her historical significance, subtly reminding audiences that she is a known quantity, a steady hand in turbulent times. When Tulsi Gabbard speaks, coverage often foregrounds controversy, framing her positions as departures rather than contributions, and her motives as suspect rather than principled. Neither portrayal is entirely false, but the imbalance shapes perception long before viewers reach their own conclusions. This is how narrative gravity works, pulling interpretation toward power almost automatically. The irony is that media institutions often insist they are merely reflecting reality, not shaping it, even as they select which questions are asked and which are quietly ignored. Pelosi's statements are frequently contextualized, softened by historical framing and institutional rationale. Gabbard's statements are frequently isolated, stripped of broader context, and presented as provocations rather than arguments. This asymmetry creates a situation where one figure is allowed complexity, while the other is reduced to a headline. Is it any wonder that public trust erodes when audiences sense that scrutiny itself is unevenly distributed? There is a particularly sharp edge to this dynamic in televised interviews and panel discussions where tone often matters more than substance. Pelosi is rarely interrupted, rarely challenged aggressively, and rarely forced to linger on uncomfortable questions. Gabbard, by contrast, is often pressed to clarify, defend, or distance herself from her own words, as though dissent itself requires explanation. The message is subtle but clear. Authority speaks. Critics justify themselves. For viewers paying attention, that imbalance speaks louder than any explicit endorsement. Humor again emerges as a coping mechanism for audiences who recognize the pattern but feel powerless to change it. Late-night jokes, social media memes, and sarcastic commentary flourish precisely because they puncture the seriousness with which power cloaks itself. When establishment figures are gently teased, it is framed as affectionate ribbing. When dissenters are mocked, it is framed as deserved correction. This difference may seem trivial, but it reinforces who is safe to question and who is not. Nancy Pelosi's long relationship with legacy media was built during an era when access and exclusivity were currency. Reporters needed sources, leadership needed favorable framing, and a mutually reinforcing ecosystem developed over time. Tulsi Gabbard's rise occurred in a fractured media environment where bypassing traditional gatekeepers was not only possible, but often necessary. That alone positioned her as a threat to established norms, regardless of the substance of her views. When politicians no longer depend on the same channels for legitimacy, those channels lose leverage, and resistance follows. This shift helps explain why Gabbard's media presence often feels adversarial, even when she is discussing policy rather than personality. She speaks directly to audiences who feel alienated by polished talking points and carefully curated outrage. Pelosi speaks to institutions that value predictability, message discipline, and continuity. Both approaches reach millions, but they generate trust in fundamentally different ways. The friction between them is less about content than about control. One of the most consequential effects of media framing is how it shapes the boundaries of acceptable debate. When dissenting views are consistently framed as extreme or irresponsible, the range of ideas considered serious narrows. Pelosi's positions, even when controversial, are treated as part of a legitimate spectrum. Gabbard's positions, even when shared by a significant portion of the public, are often treated as outliers. This narrowing does not eliminate disagreement, it simply pushes it outside official channels. That displacement has consequences because ideas do not disappear when ignored. They migrate. They find expression in alternative platforms, grassroots movements, and increasingly polarized spaces. By refusing to engage substantively with critics like Gabbard, institutions risk radicalizing audiences who feel dismissed rather than persuaded. Pelosi's defenders may see this as an unfortunate side effect of leadership. Critics see it as a failure of democratic engagement. The contrast between Tulsi Gabbard and Nancy Pelosi thus becomes a case study in how media power interacts with political power to shape public reality. It reveals how some voices are amplified until they sound like consensus, while others are marginalized until they sound fringe. Neither outcome is purely organic. Both are the result of repeated editorial choices. The danger lies not in bias alone, but in invisibility, when the mechanisms of framing disappear behind claims of neutrality. Democracy struggles not when people disagree, but when they stop believing disagreement is allowed. As this analysis moves forward, the final focus will turn toward consequences, not only for these two figures, but for a political system increasingly strained by distrust, polarization, and the perception that accountability depends on status. The confrontation between Tulsi Gabbard and Nancy Pelosi is not just a media story or a party story. It is a warning about what happens when narrative control replaces public persuasion. The question now is whether the system can adapt to a reality where authority must be earned repeatedly, not assumed indefinitely. Because in a country built on skepticism of power, the greatest risk may not be dissent itself, but the fear of it. That fear, once exposed, has a way of reshaping politics far beyond any single rivalry. Every political confrontation eventually leaves the realm of personalities and enters the realm of consequences. Because what truly matters is not who won an argument, but what the system learned from being challenged. The long, uneasy tension between Tulsi Gabbard and Nancy Pelosi forces a reckoning that neither side can fully control. A reckoning about legitimacy, trust, and the shrinking patience of the American public. Pelosi's career represents the apex of institutional power achieved through discipline, endurance, and mastery of procedural politics. Gabbard's trajectory represents something far less predictable, a willingness to sacrifice comfort and access in order to question assumptions that have hardened into dogma. Neither path is clean, and neither is free of contradiction. For Nancy Pelosi, the challenge is not whether she has served effectively in the past, but whether past success can justify present insulation. Institutions often confuse longevity with consent, assuming that surviving long enough is evidence of continued public approval. Yet approval is not permanent, and trust does not renew itself automatically with each election cycle. Pelosi's leadership style, so effective at consolidating power, struggles in an era where voters demand not just results, but visible accountability. The danger is not corruption in the cinematic sense, but detachment. A gradual drift away from the lived realities of the people representation is meant to serve. Tulsi Gabbard's role in this story is equally complicated because dissent alone does not guarantee wisdom. Challenging power is easier than governing responsibly, and skepticism can harden into cynicism if it is not paired with constructive vision. Gabbard's appeal lies in her refusal to perform ideological loyalty, but that refusal also limits her influence within systems built on coalition maintenance. Her critics argue that she underestimates the fragility of democratic institutions. Her supporters argue that institutions unwilling to hear criticism are already fragile. This is where the conflict stops being about two women and becomes about a political culture at a crossroads. American democracy was designed to assume friction, not consensus, and to treat disagreement as a feature rather than a flaw. When parties prioritize control over persuasion, they may win short-term stability at the cost of long-term legitimacy. When dissenters prioritize disruption without pathways to reform, they risk alienating those they hope to convince. The balance between these forces is not theoretical. It shapes policy outcomes, public trust, and civic engagement. There is a quiet, almost uncomfortable question lurking beneath every exchange between Gabbard and Pelosi, one that neither side addresses directly. If the system truly works as advertised, why does it react so defensively to internal scrutiny? And if dissent is genuinely dangerous, why does suppressing it so often make the public more curious rather than more compliant? Power, when confident, explains itself. Power, when insecure, demands silence. The future implications of this confrontation extend far beyond party lines. Younger voters, independents, and politically homeless Americans are watching not just what leaders say, but how they respond when challenged. They are less interested in polished speeches and more interested in whether rules apply evenly. They notice when accountability feels selective, when mistakes are contextualized for some and weaponized against others. And once that perception takes hold, reversing it becomes extraordinarily difficult. Nancy Pelosi's defenders may argue that history will vindicate her, that experience and results will ultimately outweigh criticism. Tulsi Gabbard's supporters may argue that history rewards those who speak uncomfortable truths before they become obvious. Both claims may be partially correct, which is precisely why this conflict resists simple resolution. Politics is not a courtroom where verdicts are final. It is a continuous negotiation between power and permission. When permission erodes, power must adapt or harden. Perhaps the most revealing aspect of this entire dynamic is how little it depends on specific policies. The emotional intensity comes from something deeper, a sense that the political class operates under a different set of expectations than the public. Gabbard gives voice to that suspicion. Pelosi embodies the system that must answer it. The discomfort arises not because one is entirely right and the other entirely wrong, but because both reflect truths the country is struggling to reconcile. In the end, the confrontation between Tulsi Gabbard and Nancy Pelosi is not a story about betrayal or bravery alone. It is a story about what happens when institutions built for stability encounter a generation that no longer equates stability with justice. It is about whether political loyalty is owed upward to leadership or outward to constituents. It is about whether accountability is a principle or a performance. And it is about whether American democracy can tolerate honest disagreement without mistaking it for disloyalty. The most dangerous outcome would not be choosing the wrong side in this debate. The most dangerous outcome would be refusing to have the debate at all. Because systems that silence their critics do not become stronger, they become brittle. And brittle systems, history reminds us, do not break gradually. They shatter when no one expects it.